Welcome to the It's Elementary podcast hosted by Dr. David Watson and me, Dr. Jessica LaGrone. This is a podcast about exploring theological curiosity where we talk to interesting people and explore topics that come through Asbury Theological Seminary here in Wilmore, Kentucky. Thanks for joining us here on It's Elementary Adventures in Theological Curiosity. And I'm Jessica LaGrone. I am here this morning, kind of flying solo in the studio doing an interview, but I wanted to welcome you. And we're here at the podcast studio at Asbury Theological Seminary, where we've started this podcast. We're so glad you've decided to come in and join us because we're exploring all of these areas that Asbury is so rich in thinking about these levels of higher education and learning in theology and all of the questions that really kind of get our brains turning. But we want to talk about them at a level that is so accessible. I've always heard you don't really understand anything until you can explain it to like a 10-year-old, right? And so that's why the elementary title, and that's why we're here today. We're actually joined in the studio this morning by Dr. Christine Johnson. She is an associate professor of historical theology and Wesleyan studies here at Asbury. And if you hang around long enough, you hear lots of talk between students in the halls about their favorite classes, their favorite professors. And I just want to say this morning, Chris, we're excited to welcome you, but I also want to say I hear so much chatter from students about your classes and what people are learning. And we're just thrilled that you could come and join us on the podcast this morning.
Well, I'm so glad to be here this morning.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, tell us a little bit about how you came to be a professor at a seminary. Is this something that you grew up thinking, someday this is where I want to be, what I want to do when I grow up? Or what is your journey like to get to this point of teaching here at Asbury?
Yes. So no, I never envisioned being a seminary professor. That was just not something that I grew up thinking, this is what I want to do. Yeah. Actually, from about the time that I was in 8th grade all the way through high school, I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor.
Really?
Yeah. So my first 2 years of college, my associate's degree is in science and math. So it seems like a very unlikely transition to go into ministry. But I really started discerning a call to ministry after those first couple of years of college. And my thought was, well, if you're called to ministry, you become a pastor, right?
Like that's
what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I ended up going to Indiana Wesleyan for my bachelor's degree and was really highly influenced by one of my professors. His name was Dr. Bud Bentz.
Okay.
And one day I was in the cafeteria, I was just standing there, and he came zipping by me in the cafeteria line, and he stopped and said, "Hey, Chris, I read one of your papers, and you know what? I really think you need to think about going on for further studies." Wow. And that just really planted a seed in my mind that, here I am today. So
that's so cool. And now you get to do that with students here at the seminary. And I'm sure you recognize some similar things in them when you read their work or talk to them and think, maybe this is someone that wants to continue on in their education.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of my greatest pleasures of being a seminary professor is that we really do get to be a part of students' lives. And I think of how much both my undergrad professors, but also my seminary professors influence me. Yeah. And I hope that I can do that for my students as well.
That's wonderful. Well, I love that you're in the classroom really focusing on this area of Wesleyan theology and helping us understand who we are in this rich history and heritage and future of Wesleyanism. So many people from this family that came from John and Charles Wesley and their crew that we all love to talk about and think about. And you have a particular area of study in Wesleyan theology. And tell us about that and kind of how you came to this area. It's John Wesley's Theology of Death. Is that correct?
That is correct.
This seems like an unusual thing to get into, Chris. How did that happen?
Yes. In fact, typically I have to have a captive audience in order to be able to explain my area of expertise because not a lot of people want to talk about death, right? But I truly appreciate John Wesley's theology surrounding this whole area of death and dying. In fact, as I began to study Wesley here at Asbury Seminary, I recognized that this theme of death continues to come up in Wesley's theology over and over again. And so that really captured my interest. I was especially appreciative of knowing that the early Methodists, one of the things they were known for was dying well.
Wow.
And to really think about that, especially in our context where we don't like to talk about death, we don't, it's sort of a taboo subject.
It is.
So, I mean, to know that our spiritual forefathers and mothers were known for dying well, that speaks very loudly in our context today. And so it just really captured my interest.
That's interesting. Was there anything in your own personal experience or your family life that kind of brought that to the forefront of your thinking, this issue of dying well?
Yes. So when I was a senior in high school, my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer. And we were very privileged. I know not all families would be able to do this, but both of my older sisters are nurses. And so we were able to care for my grandma all the way, from her diagnosis all the way through her actual death in our home. We moved the hospital bed in, and we were all around her bedside when she died in our home. And I consider that a privilege. I know a lot of families would have sheltered their children from that or, would have not been able to do that. But just when I came to John Wesley's theology, as I reflected on not just my grandma's death, but how she died, John Wesley gave me the theological framework and the language to use to help me understand my grandma's death in a deeper way, I would say.
Yeah. What was that like for your family? What was that like for you? So you were a senior in high school?
I was 17 years old,
right.
And it gives me a lot of compassion, first of all, for caregivers, because it was it was a privilege, like I said, but it's also very tiring.
Definitely.
And, your lives kind of rotate around the caregiving and the medical aspects and, everything that's involved in that. But it also really helped shape my understanding of death. As a 17-year-old girl, who watching my grandma die and watching God's faithfulness to her in all of that, it really helped take away that fear of death. Because I recognized how faithful God was to her, and obviously how faithful God will be to all of us when it's our time to die. That really, I think it impacts you in a way once you have sat by the bedside of a loved one in a way that if you haven't experienced that, you just don't have context for it.
Right. And you used the phrase dying well. And that Wesley was really emphasizing that in his writing. He even, didn't he have several deathbed accounts that he wrote about when he talked about others dying?
Yes. So a lot of my dissertation work was, I studied all of the deathbed accounts that he published. He actually would have his preachers sit at the deathbed and record what happened. Like they would record final words and prayers and maybe things that happened around the deathbed. And then they would send those accounts to Wesley, and Wesley would then take those accounts and he would select, he actually published 280 deathbed accounts in his Arminian magazine during the time that he was editor. And he published those for the Methodists to read and to be, some of the deaths were not desirable, right? Like this is not how you want to die. But there were others that, the Methodists really wanted to emulate. And so it's really fascinating that part of their regular reading material was reading about the deathbed scenes of their fellow Methodists.
Wow. Do you have are there any ones that stand out to you? Any particular like stories that Wesley shared that you think this is one that just feels like a treasure that is still living in your head?
Yes. So I have to say that a lot of the deathbed scenes follow a pattern.
Okay.
So if you were to say, okay, Chris, I have a deathbed, one of the accounts that Wesley has published here, I could almost tell you the pattern that it would follow,
Okay.
right? Because a lot of the deathbed scenes fit into a pattern, and that's not because Wesley was trying to box people into a particular experience, but rather I think it's patterns of God's grace, how God was working in the early Methodist lives.
Okay.
And some of it's very cultural, but one of the things that I really like about John Wesley's deathbed accounts is that he doesn't try to I would use the language of clean them up.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Because you have to imagine 18th century England, this is pre-modern medicine. And so they don't have things like pain management, right? Or, so some of the deathbed scenes, if you have a bit of a weak stomach, Wesley doesn't try to sanitize them.
No.
What he does do is he emphasizes God's grace in the moment, right? And the recognition that no matter what was happening at the deathbed, that God's grace reigns supreme. So you ask some of my favorites. Some of my favorites would be when the Methodists would actually invite people to their deathbed. They would say, tell my friends, tell my neighbors, come and see a Christian die.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Because they were so confident in the love and grace of God in that moment that they were inviting people to the deathbed to see a Christian die. That's so powerful. And you just see people's individual personalities bleed through. So, you have Elizabeth Fluke, who is very dramatic in her deathbed scene, right? She spreads out her arms and says, wings, wings, I'm soaring over death,
Wow.
And then you have others who are much more quiet. But, there's an elderly gentleman who just keeps raising his hand, right? And they say, what are you doing when you're doing this? And he says, it's my sign, right? It's my sign that I'm triumphing over death.
Wow.
And so you have literally hundreds of these deathbed scenes and more. There were more that Wesley did not publish, and you can read those in some of his journals and other writings. But hundreds of these deathbed scenes where you see the grace of God at work in individuals' lives. It's so powerful.
That's so striking to me, especially you said that God's grace reigns supreme even at the moment of death.
Right.
And what must that have been like for people to either be present or read about it, or for Wesley to think, we've got to get the word out about this, right? Because if God's grace is reigning supreme at this pivotal moment here at the end of life, then what must God be doing in our everyday lives? How is his grace available to us in this? So did he make that connection of what does this mean for how we live, how we die as well?
Yes, absolutely. Really, Wesley is following in a tradition that has been around in the church for a very long time. It's called the Ars Moriendi tradition.
Okay.
And it literally translated means the art of dying.
Wow.
Right? And just like any art that we would learn, whether it's music or painting or whatever it is a skill that we want to learn, it takes time, it takes effort. This art of dying or the work of dying well, it takes time and effort. And so to live well is the journey that takes us to the moment when we die well, right?
Right.
So it's very interesting how Wesley just kind of taps into this very old tradition within the church and brings it forward to his context. And I think it speaks for what we could do today, right?
Right. That's so interesting. The art of dying well. And that is not something we talk about today. I mean, it's just not.
No.
We almost sweep death under the carpet. I'm thinking about this stark contrast. You're telling me that Wesley is writing about this in Armenian Magazine, and people are picking up copies to read about death. And here, in our current culture and context, at least here in the West,
Yes.
death is almost something we avoid talking about. We have all these euphemisms. We talk about someone passing or someone, we lost someone. I'll never forget pastoring in a church and a woman whose husband had died, and everyone kept saying, "I'm so sorry you lost your husband." It made her so angry. She said, "I haven't misplaced him. I know
Right.
exactly where he is."
Right.
And she wanted to be upfront and talk about it, and people were sort of trying to soften it and quiet. We almost don't want to talk about death in our own culture. Are we missing out? Are we losing something by not embracing? I mean, death is something that 100% of the population is going to experience.
That's right.
Right?
I like to say you will at least want to talk to me at least once in your life, right? Because,
Right.
people don't want to talk about death until it's immediately facing them. And I think that's so unfortunate, because what we're doing is we stand on such a rich heritage, right? Of people who have died well, people who have given us tools to deal with death and dying, issues of death and dying. But we've sort of plugged our ears to all of it.
Definitely.
Until we're in a moment of crisis. And my passion for this subject, it's not that I love death, right? But my passion is that we stand on such a rich heritage, and our God is so good and so gracious and so faithful, that why shouldn't we prepare people before they're in moments of crisis, before they've had that terminal diagnosis, right? So one of the things that Wesley talked about a lot in his theology is that we need to do the work of the deathbed before we're there, right? Because, I mean, think about it. When I'm sick, let's just say I have the flu, right? I don't feel like doing anything, right? Much less deep spiritual work. And for Wesley to die well meant that we had done that deep spiritual work far prior to this moment of crisis, so that when the moment of death came, we could welcome death, right? We as believers have a very complicated relationship with death.
We do.
Because on the one hand, it is that last enemy to be conquered, right? Death is a result of sin, and it is an enemy. On the other hand, death is what ushers us into our Heavenly Father's presence. And so we have this complicated relationship with death, and Wesley's caution to people was, don't leave the work of the deathbed to that moment of crisis when you don't feel like doing anything, right? He really, my entire book is about Wesley's theology, actually his Ordo Salutis, leading up to the deathbed. Because if we have walked this path of grace, we would be prepared to meet death, with open arms, so to speak.
Right. So is the deep spiritual work you're talking about, you referred to the Ordo Salutis. Give that to us in our elementary context. What does Ordo Salutis mean? And is that the deep spiritual work that Wesley's encouraging us to do?
So really what Wesley does, the Ordo Salutis is really Wesley's order of salvation, right? And so at each point, this is my argument, is that at each point along the way, Wesley is really talking about how we overcome sin, right? And in overcoming sin, we are overcoming that great enemy, death, right? a lot of people don't realize that Wesley actually struggled very, very deeply with fear of death and dying in
Okay.
his early years. I'm sure many of us will be familiar with Wesley's encounter with the Moravians when he was on his way to Georgia and they encounter this great storm.
Mm.
And Wesley looks at the English and they're all screaming, right? Because they think they're going to die.
That's right.
I can't imagine being in that situation. He writes about the waves just like, overcoming the boat almost that he was on.
Terrifying.
And he looks over at the Moravians, and the Moravians were calmly singing. They were singing hymns of praise. And Wesley asked them after this is over, weren't you afraid of dying? And the Moravians said, no, we're not afraid to die. And so Wesley, you can almost see him kind of like pushing back against this. And he said, yes, but weren't your women and children afraid of dying? And the Moravians said, no, our women and children are not afraid to die.
Wow.
And Wesley was so struck by that, that you can see him grappling in his journals with his fear of death, because he recognized that if he truly loved God in the way that he should, that this fear of death would not be an issue for him.
Wow.
And so as he begins this journey, right, this spiritual journey where he, of course, we have his Aldersgate experience, but as he begins looking at what does the work of the new birth do for us, right? Well, one of the gifts of the new birth is assurance, right? It's this hope that we have. And of course, Wesley has this great doctrine of entire sanctification. And when he describes entire sanctification, he talks about it in terms of perfect love.
Okay.
Well, what do we know about, what does Scripture tell us about perfect love? Perfect love casts out all fear.
Exactly.
Therefore, those who have, faithfully walked this Christian path, who have experienced entire sanctification, can come to the end of their lives and have perfect love, which casts out all fear, including the fear of death.
Wow.
And that's the testimony that you see again and again portrayed at these Methodist deathbed scenes. So really, Wesley is working out his theology, and he's using death not just as a metaphor for all of this, but he's actually testing his theology at those deathbeds. Like, are people really experiencing this? Are they dying without fear? And the answer was yes.
Wow. That's amazing. And you don't talk about Wesley or Wesleyan theology for very long without hearing the word sanctification and thinking, this is sort of our gift. This is the thing that resides in Wesleyan theology that you don't find in other places. You find language about justification, about entering in relationship with God. You find language about God's love, but boy, sanctification, you're probably in a Wesleyan context if somebody's emphasizing this very much, right?
That's
so
right.
it's sort of the air we breathe in this Wesleyan family. And I think what you're saying is it's also very connected to his understanding of death. How is this talk about sanctification and even entire sanctification, which is an entirely Wesleyan thing to talk about, connected with this understanding? Was he expecting that people had experienced entire sanctification? Was it something that happened at the moment of death? Help me with how those things interplay with each other.
Yes. So this is a really interesting topic because I find that we don't talk about entire sanctification a lot these days. And I think that's sad. I think that's something that we need to do more of, right? Because Wesley said that it wasn't just possible, but that every believer would experience entire sanctification in this lifetime. Right?
Wow.
And so, I like to, when I talk about it in my class, I like to explain it this way. Every Christian tradition, it doesn't matter what tradition you come from, we all agree on one thing, and that is that there is no sin in the presence of God.
That's right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll use the language, there's no sin in heaven.
Right.
Well, every tradition has a way of working this out. Our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters would turn toward purgatory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of our Reformed brothers and sisters will talk about that issue of sin, the sinful nature being cleansed in death, right?
Okay.
Wesley is going to, he recognizes that there are these options out there, and he rejects them because he said, why would I make one? First of all, he was very Protestant, right? So he's not going to agree with purgatory. But he also says, why would we make death, which we know is a result of sin, and an enemy, that last enemy to be conquered, why would we give that more power than we would the atoning work of Christ, right?
That's right.
And so for Wesley, this cleansing of the sinful nature, or what we will call entire sanctification, had to happen in this lifetime, right? And so oftentimes it was associated with the deathbed. Why? Well, first of all, because sometimes it takes that kind of serious moment of crisis to really focus us, right? And so Wesley realized that's it's very common to have entire sanctification occur on the deathbed as someone is dying. But Wesley believed that because God's grace is so good and so great, that it could happen years before a person died. In fact, that was the ideal, right? But that oftentimes it did happen at the deathbed. And so we see entire sanctification and death being linked. Wesley also uses death as a metaphor for entire sanctification because, I don't know if you've ever seen someone die. Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint the exact moment of death because respirations decrease, and they might take a breath and then they don't breathe for a minute and then they'll take another breath. And Wesley said sometimes that's how, spiritually speaking, we think that the sinful nature is gone, right? I haven't felt this pull for a long time. And then it takes another breath.
Wow.
Right? And so we realize, oh no, there's deeper work to be done. And so he uses death as both a metaphor and physical death as a proving ground for this whole doctrine of entire sanctification.
So it's very connected for him.
It's very connected
That's
for
so
him.
cool. And it strikes me as even as you're talking about the physical nature of death and what that looks like, it seems like the path that you started out on, thinking about medicine and science, God doesn't waste anything, does he?
No, he does not.
All of that background has kind of come with you into this place. And then, when you were working on your PhD, working through what to study, you really leaned into this topic. And now, jokingly, I've heard students talk about calling you Dr. Death, right? Because this is such a topic, but it's not a topic we find many people who can speak on. And you have a book that's coming out that is Triumphant Death, Grace, Holiness, and Death in the Theology of John Wesley. Those are not words we hear combined very often. So why Triumphant Death? Tell us a little bit about this book. When can we get our hands on it? Where can we find it? And what's the content there that might really help us?
Yes. So, it's out. Oh, it just was published.
Fantastic.
So people can order it from Amazon or Whip and Stock, wherever you want to go to order it. It is out. Finally.
Congratulations.
I'm so excited. But yes, oftentimes we don't think about death in theological terms like grace and holiness, right? But really, Wesley came to the conclusions that he came to about death and dying because of his theology, right? And so what I do in the book is I start out by exploring a little bit about what Wesley's own context, some of his own personal struggles with this whole area of death and dying, Of course, in 18th century England, death was really a part of
That's right.
everyday life.
Every family experienced it.
I
Yes.
mean, even John Wesley, most people don't realize John Wesley was the third son to bear the name of John in his family,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
Because, they lost half of their children to death.
Wow.
That was a very common experience.
Mm.
So death is, in his context, very vividly, and he has to grapple with this. So I look a little bit at his own context, but then what I start doing is I start going through all of the major points of Wesley's theology.
Mhm.
The new birth, I look at his doctrine of prevenient grace
Mhm.
and how that feeds into things. I look at the process of sanctification. I look at entire sanctification.
Mm.
And I look at how he deals with this whole topic of death at each point along his way of salvation. And then in the final chapter, we start exploring these deathbed accounts and then how John Wesley himself died. It's very, very interesting to see how this all connects.
Mm-hmm. That is interesting. Does he also, take the next bridge of thought, which is to say, let's talk about what happens after death, and what do we understand about that based on Scripture, on Wesley's writings? Where are we headed in this triumphant death, this journey?
Yes. And to answer your question, why triumphant death?
Yeah.
Because literally the Methodists, and these are their words,
Mm.
they are when they are on their deathbed, often you will hear them say, I am triumphing over sin,
Mm.
death, and the devil.
Okay.
Right? So
Wow.
they're using the language of triumph
Mm.
themselves, which is why I chose it.
Mhm.
But Wesley really, full redemption for Wesley does not happen until Christ comes and makes all things new,
Mm.
right? So that final resurrection, when there's new creation,
Mm.
Christ reigns over all. That for Wesley is full redemption. So this really is anticipatory, right?
Right.
And he has some very what I would like to call imaginative sermons about what that new creation will be.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just so fascinating to me. When Wesley talks about, what will the animal realm be like?
Mm.
What will we as humans be like in this new creation?
Mhm.
It really is very positive and hopeful.
So he has beautiful thoughts about what lies ahead for
Yes,
people in the kingdom.
absolutely.
That's so perfect. I've just been thinking about the culture, the time we're living in, how chaotic things are both in the news
Yes.
and in people's personal lives. And when we see this world that is just hurting and in pain and think,
Yeah.
what do we have to offer them? What is it about Wesleyan theology that is a unique gift to just the state we find our world in, the chaotic spaces, the grieving spaces? Why should people be leaning into these Wesleyan roots that we've been given?
Yeah, I like to say that Wesley, his theology is so optimistic about what the grace of God can do, not just in our lives today, but what God has planned for us tomorrow.
Mhm.
I call him the greatest optimist of grace that I have ever encountered.
Wow.
And Wesleyan theology is really a theology of hope.
Mm.
And joy in the present moment as well. We don't really hear that today. We hear a lot of despair over current context.
Yes.
We see a lot of kind of dystopian themes,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And we're not really talking about the way that God's grace provides hope for today and hope for tomorrow.
Mhm.
And that's just so unfortunate because that's the theology that we have been gifted through Wesleyan theology.
Mhm. I love describing it as an optimistic framework for looking at the world, because
Yes.
there are other even even Christian contexts that see the nature of humanity very pessimistically. Oh, we're going to wake up and sin again. We're going to sin again. We're
Right.
once a sinner, always a sinner is kind of
Right.
and the Wesleyan context just sees that the redemption of people can be fully known in this lifetime.
That's right.
And that our unity with Christ can be fully known in some way. What is it that has why are we sort of a lesser known family of faith in some circles? What is so popular about these other contexts of faith that have spread so widely?
Yeah. I think, I don't know. I've actually been asking myself that
Right.
very question, right? And I've been telling my students, okay, now that you've been introduced to Wesley's theology, it's your job to get out there and spread this message, right?
Yes.
Because Wesley really felt like one of the reasons why God allowed the Methodist revival to spread
Mm,
and to thrive was because of his doctrine of entire
that's
sanctification,
right.
which is, as you said, very optimistic about what God's grace can do in our lives today, right? We, I think in some ways we've stopped talking about the doctrine of entire sanctification, right?
Right.
And because we've stopped talking about it, we've lost that messaging, right?
Mm.
But if we really think about what Wesley is saying that God can do in our lives,
Mm.
God can really allow us not just to overcome willful sin, right? Although that is a message that Wesley has for people. We don't have to be stuck in sin,
Mm.
right? God's grace is so great that he can actually break the bondage of sin in our life.
Mm.
But Wesley goes further and says, no, not only will we be free from willful sin, but we can actually fulfill the great commandment, which is to love God, not just with some of our heart or most of it, but with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength, and to love our neighbor as ourself. We can truly have God's love fill our heart in such a way that it pushes out all sin, right? And that is such a beautiful, hopeful message. I really hope that that we can get that out to people who desperately need to hear what God's grace can do in their lives, because they've been pushed into some of these very pessimistic theologies that say, well, you can get a little better, but God can't really cleanse you from sin, right? And that's just so it's so pessimistic about what God's grace can do.
Right. I've wondered too why we hear less about the beauty of entire sanctification, the hope of entire sanctification. I think about pastors who are thinking about what to preach on, how to communicate God's grace to people, and the ways that we do that. And I think maybe there's some fear there of being having kind of a magnifying glass on you. So, if somebody decides, well, I'm going to get up and preach like the fullness of salvation means you can be absolutely freed from the power of sin. I wonder if people think, wow, now my congregation or my class or my friends, if I talk about this thing, they're going to be looking at me like, but I saw you yell at your kids this morning, or, but I saw you interact in a way that was less than perfect. How dare you talk about perfection? So I wonder if people even are putting that kind of pressure on themselves to be able to teach on it. But the way you talk about loving God with all heart, soul, mind, and strength, that just seems really appealing. And maybe even this word perfection has gotten in our way, do you think? What other words, does perfection really grasp what sanctification is, or are there other ways that we describe that?
Right. Wesley recognized himself that this term perfect was problematic, because when people think about perfect, they think about something that you can't improve upon, right? And so Wesley was asked the question, why do you use the term Christian perfection? And he said, well, I use the term perfect because I find it in Scripture, and I can't back away from it. But he very carefully explained what he meant by perfect, right? And for Wesley, those who have experienced entire sanctification, it's not a sinless perfection, right?
Okay.
Because we've all heard, the little blue-haired lady that stands up in church and says, "Well, I haven't sinned for 30 years."
Oh my goodness.
Right? Okay. Wesley said, "Look, those who have been perfected in love, they still are prone to error." Right? They still will make mistakes. And sometimes that will lead them to actually sin, right? They miss that mark, they fall short. But it is the motive of their heart has been so purified that it is never an intentional, right?
Okay.
I like to use an example. I live very close. I grew up very close to the Canadian border, and oftentimes you would get Canadian change mixed in with your own change.
Right.
And if it's a penny, nobody's worried about it. But if you pay someone with all Canadian quarters, that's a problem,
yes.
right? And so if you paid someone unknowingly with all Canadian quarters, did you shortchange them? Well, of course you did. But did you intend to? Well, no, you made a mistake. Wesley said those who are perfect, they're still prone to what he would call mental and bodily infirmities. They're still prone to error. They're still prone to mistake. So we have to very carefully define our terms, right? He never preached what he called a sinless perfection. What he did preach is that God's love could so fill our hearts that it pushes out sin. Right? And so all of our motivations, our intentions have been purified, and they are marked by God's love and by God's grace, and not by any kind of sinful intent. Right? And so I do think that we have to very carefully clarify our terms.
Yes.
I think we also very carefully have to watch how we speak about holiness, right? Because sometimes we've talked about holiness as like the do's and the don'ts,
yes,
right?
Definitely.
Or it becomes a very dour, like, oh, you have to be holy, right? But holiness, when it's seen in its true form, it's beautiful, it's winsome, and you want more of it. Like when I read Wesley's description of Christian perfection and a plain account of Christian perfection, I feel something in my heart just lean toward that. I long for that, right? Because it's so beautiful. Holiness isn't dour. It's not about a list of rules. It's not about doing or not doing the right thing. It's about loving God with all of our heart, right? And loving our neighbor as we love ourselves.
Right.
So I think we have to be very careful how we talk about holiness.
Yes. I love how you talk about that because it's so winsome. It really draws us, and it's not kind of a beat you over the head holiness.
Right.
It's more of just this power of God drawing us, and that it's not in our strength. That it's not something we achieve on our own. And so we're not saying to people, just try harder, be better, be perfect, get it together, right?
Right.
That we're communicating something about God's power.
That's right.
God's grace, and that we're even communicating that this doesn't happen in isolation. No. It's never something that happens to us alone. There's all this talk among the early Methodists about how we come together to do this. And I wonder if we're missing a piece of that as well in how we talk about, really the Christian life today, that we're not just encouraging people to go in their own little cell, their own little prayer closet, their own little devotional life, but we're opening that up into a life of community. That seems really clear with the early Methodists. They're all getting together all the time. You got a class, you got a band, you're just together. And then it seems super clear in the early church right? We
Yes.
cannot do this separately. We're always coming together. Do you think that that is something that we can capture more today, or something that maybe our own context of how we explain the Christian life need more of this communal life as part of them?
Yes. When I talk to students today, what I am hearing from them is a longing for Christian community.
Right.
We have moved into this really new world of technology,
Hmm.
where you would hope that technology would bring us closer together. But the more research I'm doing about all of our apps and our social media and all of that, it's actually driving us into isolation
Mm.
rather than bringing us together. Um, and I am finding that students today are longing for real community, the kind of community that scripture calls for, the kind of community that, as you mentioned, the early church clearly was practicing.
Hmm.
If you read the early church's documents, it was really bringing people together in community.
Right.
And Wesley himself, the one of the little known facts about Wesley is that he would invite everyone in. Like, if as long as you had a desire to flee the wrath to come, you could come, you
Mm.
could be a part of the Methodist society,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But if you wanted to remain and be a Methodist,
Hmm.
you had to join a class.
Right.
It wasn't optional.
That's right.
Right? And that sounds very off-putting to us, right? Like, oh, what do you mean? I've got to meet together once a week and I have to, answer questions like, how is it with your soul?
Hmm.
But Wesley found that it to really become holy people, we need that kind of Christian accountability,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
And it's beautiful. It's what I find people longing for,
Mm.
especially young people today.
Hmm.
And so I think sometimes we're a little scared to what I would call set the bar high, right?
Right.
Um, but I think that's what our hearts long for, is to know clearly, um, you know, the kinds of community that we are being called into and how we can work out many of these questions that we have about our spiritual journey, how we can become holy people can only happen in community. In fact, Wesley has very strong language around this. He says there is no such thing as a solitary Christian, right?
Absolutely.
We've all heard the phrase, there's no holiness but social holiness. That is
Right.
probably the most misrepresented
Right.
phrase
Right.
that Wesley has.
Tell us what it means and what people think it means.
Yes, of course, Wesley, people hear social holiness and they immediately think of social justice, right? It's not that Wesley didn't have social justice. There was plenty there.
So much.
That's another conversation, right? For another day. But when Wesley used that phrase, what he was really talking about, there is no holiness but social holiness, he meant that we have to be in community with one another, in accountability with one another. Otherwise, we will never become holy people.
Mm.
Like, think about it. How do you practice the fruit of the Spirit
Right.
if you're never with people who try your patience
Right.
or who, put you in situations where you have to be long suffering, right?
Yeah.
You just can't develop these kinds of spiritual muscles if you're alone.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. That's so good. And I wonder if there's some people listening and watching who say, gosh, you talk a lot about Wesley on this podcast. And we do. We do. It's the heart of, it's kind of our family tree. It's where we come from. It's in our DNA and in our blood. But maybe there's somebody wondering, like, I'd like to know more about what it means to be a Wesleyan Christian, or I'm sort of a beginner at understanding. My church has some rootedness in Wesley's family, but I really don't know where to start. Is there like a beginner place for people who want to explore Wesleyanism? If I'm not coming to get a master's degree and sit in your class, Chris, where could somebody begin to understand more about where this beautiful Wesleyan rootedness comes from? Is there a book or a place that people could go to learn more?
Yeah. So I would recommend a couple of different things. First of all, when I introduce Wesley to my class, I actually have them pick up a biography of Wesley.
Okay.
Because it tells about Wesley's own context, his journey, and you can kind of see, even from his own experiences, how his theology develops. So we read a biography about Wesley. It's called The Theological Journey. It's by Dr. Ken Collins.
Okay.
That's where I have them start, because I know that God loves good stories,
Yes,
because
that's
we
right.
all have been given a great story,
That's
and
right.
God works through our stories, right? So that's where I would recommend. I also would recommend having people there are so many great resources online. You can, get almost anything online these days, but I would start with reading some of Wesley's sermons even.
Yes.
Read Wesley. I always encourage people, read Wesley for Wesley himself,
Yes.
right? Let him speak to you,
Right.
not mediated through someone else, but just
Right.
pick up some of his sermons and begin reading some of his sermons. They are so theologically rich.
I love that. I love that. And now we have your own book.
And yes, my own book.
As a
yes.
resource. Congratulations again on that coming out. That sounds like
Thank
a
you.
fantastic way. And I just thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time today to speak to us, but also for the way that you continue to invest not only in our students here at Asbury, but in the life and community of the church and the way that you are pouring yourself out into that. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective and talking to you today.
Well, thank you. It's been a privilege for me to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's been our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps other people find us. And remember to subscribe to receive future episodes. We'll see you next time.